my name is William F. Armstrong. I'm originally from York, Pennsylvania, having gone to parochial school at St. Pat's and graduated from York Catholic in 1960. I entered the Air Force shortly thereafter, and I stayed in the Air Force for approximately 5 years. My Uncle George A. Wood was born in Petersville, Maryland in 1896. The family moved from Petersville in 1905 here to York, Pennsylvania. Records show that he worked at York Machinery, and that was through research done by Stephen. And so he went in the military in 1918, and shortly after training, he ended up in France in 1919, and he was killed in action on September 29, 1919. He was buried in France for approximately 2 years, and my great-grandmother petitioned the United States Army to have his body brought back to Pennsylvania, which they did in August of 1921, and he was buried from St. Patrick's Church in August of 1921. Right now, we're trying to reestablish the location of his grave to have another headstone replaced there.
My name's Stephen H. Smith. I worked at York International Corporation, then in the division of Borg-Warner. It's now Johnson Controls. Retired from there. Since I've retired, I've done family history talks, local history talks, and a blog site where I wrote family history, local history about people, places, businesses, and all things York County. In 2018 was the 100th anniversary of the United States involvement in World War II, and I wrote a series of posts associated with veterans that were killed in action from York County. One of them was George Wood, and I basically became involved with him through kind of a chance encounter. I volunteer at the History Center, and somebody was asking about a person buried in St. Patrick's Cemetery, and I noticed that George Wood was on that same page. So that's how I became involved, and it kind of snowballed from there.
I've always known of him from a small boy. He had pictures. My great-grandmother was still living, and in fact, she lived with us for a while. I always had a feeling that I needed to know more about him, and well, over the course of time, there was not any family history about him other than the fact that she would mention the fact that he died in the war, but never had any real details. And it wasn't until recently, after my mother passed in 2016, I got a better feel for what he did in the military from some letters that the United States Army sent to my grandmother in relationships to his death and her being eligible for his burial insurance and a pension. And from that, I kind of got invigorated to do some research. I was talking with a young lady, and I thought he was buried in Lebanon Cemetery because of the fact back in that period of time, African Americans weren't buried in other than Lebanon Cemetery. But come to find out through the article that Stephen wrote, he was buried in St. Patrick's Cemetery. And so from there, in reading Stephen's stories, I got more invigorated to do more research on it.
My main focus was understanding why he didn't have a gravestone out there. And at one time he did, because in the 1930s, the History Center basically conducted a survey of the inscriptions on all gravestones in York County. And at that time, he had a gravestone. So at one time, he had a gravestone. So I wondered why he didn't. And I contacted the cemetery manager, and the cemetery manager, he had a difficult time locating the actual grave site. I had done some family history research on the family to try to help him. And through that, I discovered the site where I thought he was buried. Actually found his mother was buried there, and his sister was buried there in that site. So it kind of pointed me that I was in the right direction. Mr. Wood's story is important because he is the only Black York County veteran that was killed in action during World War I.
I think it's impacted us to the point where we now have a greater sense of family history that was not necessarily known, and now it's allowing us to really take account of what he did, sacrifice he made. I'm hoping that with the younger generation, that once this story is kind of all put together, it will inspire some of them to do some things that they may not have otherwise done, in terms of looking at whether you go in the military or you just have a new focus on your life in terms of making a contribution that's not necessarily, again, dying, but, better way of life, because you have someone you can look up to in terms of, having led a life that was worthy of, people being proud of, so to speak.